Welcome to part 9 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And as you can see, when we last left off, the Mad Hatter and the March Hare were stuffing the poor little dormouse into a teapot. Who would do such a thing? Clearly them two, they're a bit bonkers, aren't they? At any rate, I'll never go there again, said Alice as she picked her way through the wood. It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in all my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. That's very curious, she thought, but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once. And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall and close to the little glass table. Now, I'll manage better this time, she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. Oh, and this one's called Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. Have you ever seen croquet before? It's kind of a bit similar to golf, but there's hoops, there's like these arches that they have to put it through, and they've got they're like golf clubs, but they're almost like mallets upside down. You'll have to have a look if you're not sure from that explanation, which you might not be. Okay, here we go. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them, and just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, 5! Don't go splashing paint over me like that!" "I couldn't help it," said 5 in a sulky tone. 7 jogged me elbow." On which 7 looked up and said, "That's right, 5. Always lay the blame on others." "You better not talk," said 5, I heard the Queen say. "Only yesterday you deserved to be beheaded." And here they are having an argument. "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, 2, said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him it was for bringing the cooked tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. Would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find it out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So, you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to." At this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognised the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all this grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people all had to lie down upon their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood still where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently and turning to Alice. She went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please, your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree, for, you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of their pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." Oh dear, she looks a bit of a fearsome character, doesn't she? Reminds me of Mrs. Trunchbull. Let's have a look. The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off with—" "Nonsense," said Alice very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Oh, consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so, very carefully, with one foot. "Get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice. "Oh, that should be get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice. And the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King and the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave that off," screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And then turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "Oh, may it please your Majesty," said 2 in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had been meanwhile examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'what a pity'?" the Rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'what for?'" "She boxed the Queen's ears," the Rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," the Rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places," shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, oh no, and the mallets live flamingos. And the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make arches. Oh dear. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself round and look up in her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing, and when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way, wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head, or off with her head, about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then, she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there is anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape, and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. And she said to herself, oh, it's a Cheshire cat. Now I shall have someone to talk to. How are you getting on? Said the cat, as soon as there was a mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come, or at least one of them. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. I don't think they play fairly at all, Alice began in a rather complaining tone, and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming.